everybody, it's Helen Hillix, your host, and today I am going to be talking about one of my very favorite topics and something that comes up all the time in my coaching work, which is reactivity. I just have to take a sigh because whether I'm talking about my own marriage or my clients' situations and relationships with lovers or husbands or siblings or parents, reactivity is one of the most treacherous and undermining patterns that can exist in a relationship. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Reactivity, taming your triggers. And how many of you would love to tame your triggers? Because we are slaves to our triggers. They own us, guys. They own us. We don't own them. And of course, that's the point, isn't it? Is that we hate when we get triggered, and yet we almost always blame the other person for triggering us. So let's talk about for a moment, and I'm going to give you some very concrete tools to deal with this. I promise when you are done watching this video or listening to this podcast, you are going to have some concrete ways of handling triggers and reactivity. So don't go away. So first, let's talk about what is reactivity. We can explain it away all we want, but it's the experience when something happens, or someone says something to us, and we notice that we are upset in any way whatsoever. Whether it's a political conversation, or it's somebody that says you look fat in that outfit, or it's someone telling you, what to do, or whatever it is. If you feel yourself having a reaction of cringing, of being angry, of being defensive, of crying, of being upset in any way, you hurt my feelings, whatever it is, all of those things are reactions, all of that is reactivity. And it all is something that you can do something about. So let's talk about I'll give you some examples too. I have a client who's dating a new guy, and and she had this experience where they got really, really close, and then he kind of disappeared for a bit, and then afterwards told her, my old girlfriend contacted me. And, we went through this process. I realized I didn't want her, but, it took me a few days of processing. And she had a huge reaction to that, which, again, it's understandable. I'm not saying that reactions aren't understandable. I'm just saying that they are something that we get to learn how to tame, because when she was in that reactive state about, you abandoned me, and you said you wanted to be close, and you said how wonderful I was, and I'm not saying she said all these things to him, but she's definitely having these reactions inside herself, and she's angry and throwing her telephone, and very, very reactive about it. And then after we talked, she could see that, this is just her own insecurity coming up. There's nothing really weird or unusual about the fact that his old girlfriend contacted him and that he had some feelings about it that he needed to process. Now, could he have done a better job? And would it have been better if he had said, I want you to know that my old girlfriend contacted me. I'm not interested, but I need some time to process it. That would have been better, of course. But regardless of what the other person does and regardless of how they handle it, they are not responsible for how I react to that situation. So I encouraged her, why don't you look at it as this is a very important piece of information about how this person processes things. It's important information about how I handle it. It's an important part of a new relationship to be able to explore things. And why not be grateful about the fact that he told you the truth and didn't hide that reality from you. He could have just said, I was working really late every night, but he told you the truth. Why not reinforce that part of it? So I'm giving you some examples of how things actually happen and how they could be adjusted. And then we're going to talk about a formula to use. Let's talk about the formula now. You know, the formula is that you have a stimulus, a trigger. You know, you have a trigger. And that trigger in this case was him not responding to her very much during the week, and then him telling her why. That was the trigger. And then the reaction is the next piece. And that is what happens internally when we are face to face with that stimulus or that trigger. In this case, she was, you know, beside herself, hysterical, upset, angry, hurt, insecure. She had all these reactions internally. And then the response is how you actually externally respond to that stimulus or that trigger. Now, how can you not let the reaction internally be exactly the same as how you respond? That's the first step. That's the first key, is to be able to get some distance between your reaction internally and your response externally. Now, I just talked to a client yesterday, a guy named Mark, who had a really awesome experience in that he'd been working on some mechanical thing for hours and hours and hours, thought that it was going to take 1 hour, and 3.5 hours later, he wasn't done. He was exhausted. He was dirty. He was hungry. He was incredibly tired. And he came in the house, and his wife, who was beyond hungry, she was what they call hangry, when you're hungry, so hungry it makes you angry. And he sat down in his chair and picked up his phone, and she said, so you expect me now to just cook for you? And that was the trigger in that situation for Mark. When Susan said that, you know, Mark wanted to, of course he wanted to blast her and, you know, say something like, you know, are you kidding me? And do you know what I've been through these last few hours? And can't you tell I'm exhausted and blah, blah, blah. But in that moment, he's been working on this. He was able to put some distance between that immediate internal reaction and the response that he gave externally. He took some breaths, he centered himself, he, whatever you want to call it, bit his tongue, however, you know, processed it, stopped and realized that, wow, my wife must really be tired. She must really be hungry herself, because this isn't like her. And this is such an important piece of encouragement for you, is usually when we are triggered, we are not stopping to think how the other person must feel in that situation, to be behaving this way or saying whatever they're saying or whatever it is. We never stop and think about what they're going through. We are only absorbed by our own reaction. And this goes back to what I was saying in the very beginning about we are enslaved by our reactivity, by our triggers, because once we have that reaction, we become dumb. We don't know how to think. We don't know how to process. We don't think about being compassionate for what the other person must be going through. We just react. So bravo for Mark that he was able to stop himself from that reactivity, which he would have done in the old days and would have led to a big ugly fight between the two of them, because then she would have gotten reactive too, right? So instead, what he did was take a few moments to calm himself and center himself and think about how she must be feeling, which was a huge step. And once he had done all of those things, what do you think he actually said to his wife? He actually said, "Can I help you make some food?" Or "How can I help you?" Something like that. And I thought, wow, that is so awesome. That is real success. And once you've done that a few times, it's so reinforcing. You know, the ego gets all caught up in being reactive, but once you've been able to intervene between the reaction and the response, and you come out with a response that is much kinder and more conscious and more neutral, more supportive, more compassionate, then you realize, wow, that feels so much more powerful. We get deluded into thinking that reactivity and blame is powerful, but it isn't. It's purely impulsive and feels very immature. And when you are actually able to intervene in your own reactivity and then come out with a wise, compassionate response like Mark did of "How can I help you prepare something for the two of us?" then you get to feel so good about yourself. And you realize that you have just had dominion over your own emotions. You have just had mastery over your own reactivity. You have just been a leader in your relationship because you didn't allow that infantile little reactive voice to come out. You stopped that and you expanded yourself into your own higher consciousness. And that's power. That's real strength, guys. That is real strength. So, the first place to, and you know what, let's for a moment say that, because in the first stages of this change, you're not going to do what Mark did. You're not going to remember to intervene between the reaction and the response. You're going to have that reaction, and that's how you're going to respond. And then, but what you can do is clean that up after the fact. You can then say, "I wish I had responded this way, honey. Can we have a redo?" And I have a whole video about how to do a redo. So I'm not going to go into that right now, but it's basically just going back to the beginning and redoing that whole situation. So it's not too late to clean it up, even if you respond the way you're reacting and you don't have that time, that pause, that filter that helps you to respond in a more wise way. Even if you forget all that and you make the mistake of having a reaction that's blaming or angry or whatever, you can still clean it up after the fact. So the first step in the healing process is to notice it after it's already over and clean it up. The second step is to be able to respond differently than you're reacting, so that you take that pause after you notice you're triggered. You take that pause in between that reaction internally and what you say externally as your response. So that's the second level. And then the third level is someday some of you, and myself included, might even get to the place where you have a trigger and you're able to intervene with yourself before you even have the reaction. And I've done this a few times with a few people, including my husband, when he'll be really grumpy about something and it's complaining and whining and whatever that is. And I used to have just the biggest reaction to that. And now it's like, honey, how are you feeling about yourself? How are you feeling about yourself? Before I even get into the reaction stage, I can remember that this is a habitual thing with him, that when he's not feeling good about himself, he gets into that grumpy mood, or when he's feeling depressed or whatever it happens to be. I realize it's never about me. It's always about how he's feeling about himself. Now, the person may come back, him included, may come back and say, "I feel just fine. It's because you blah, 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 or they blah, blah, blah." And then I just get to gently remind the person that that all may be true, but it all stems back to some way that you're feeling about yourself. And this is true also on the flip side of if he says something and I do have a reaction, that I get to take a look at, I wonder why I had a reaction. And that always has to do with how I'm feeling about myself. So it's both ways. I can't say, well, of course I had a reaction because he blah, blah, blah. And that is exactly what we do. That's what we're taught. How many times have you heard that? Well, of course I'm upset because you didn't take out the trash, or of course I'm upset because one more time you didn't care about my orgasm, or whatever it is. Of course I'm upset. You spent the rent money gambling. And, you might be listening to this and saying, well, how in the world can you not be upset about somebody spending the rent money gambling? And I'm not saying that you're not having a reaction to that. I'm just saying, why does that bother me so much? Well, it bothers me so much because I knew he was a gambling addict when I met him, for instance, and I married him anyway. And now every time he spends the rent money, I feel so enraged because I should have known better, because I knew he was a gambling addict. And when you're an addict, you can't help yourself. So remember that the trigger, whether it's their trigger that makes them act a certain way in the first place, or it's my reaction to the trigger, it's always about how you're feeling about yourself. So let's go back to another example of Sarah, a young woman that I'm working with who's dating a new guy, and she happens to be living in her grandmother's house free because her grandmother died, and her mother owns the house, and her mother did not want the new boyfriend to come stay at the house that she owns, and she said so. And the daughter just had a big reaction for lots of reasons that we're not going to go into. But she was ultimately able to intervene after the reaction, because she had the reaction and that's how she responded. And then this is an example of how to clean that up after the fact. She went back to her mom after she'd gotten some support and gotten some clarity. She went back to her mom and said, I realized that I was acting the way I would have when I was a teenager and felt overly controlled or whatever. And you have every right to say who is and isn't in your home. And I'm sorry, that was not right. You have every right to set those boundaries. And her mom was so grateful, and she felt so good about herself for cleaning up that reactivity. So this is an incredible challenge that we get to be so aware of, that we get to remember that there's a stimulus, there's a reaction, and there's a response. And that it doesn't matter where you intervene in that formula, in that process. You can intervene after you've already acted like an idiot and had some huge reaction. You can intervene then. But the sooner you can intervene in that process, the less damage you're going to cause and the better you're going to feel about yourself. Because if you're always just letting yourself be guided by your reaction, and you're always then just responding in some way that's angry and blaming them for hurting your feelings, or blaming them for something, then you're going to have a lot of cleaning up to do. Let's just put it that way. You're going to have a lot of cleaning up to do, and it's going to do a lot of damage to your relationship. But if you can learn to intervene between the reaction and the response, then you can prevent a lot of needless pain. And you get to have a lot of increased self-esteem, because you see yourself behaving in a way that's very supportive to the relationship and to yourself. And if you can then learn to intervene before you even have the reaction, wow, then you really save yourself a lot of needless pain because you're not even having to go through the reaction and then process it and, prevent yourself from yelling something mean or whatever your reaction would be. Even that part, it's not, it takes a lot of work to be able to intervene before that. But once you can, you begin to see that even that part is a lot of unnecessary pain. So, all you're hoping for and working for is to learn how to intervene sooner and sooner and sooner in that process of stimulus, reaction, and response. And pretty soon, you'll get better and better at it, and your relationship will thrive because of it. If you're wanting sacred sexuality, that will be a result of this change, this shifting energy. It will enhance your intimacy. And whether, it's with your mother or your friend or your lover, it's really is the same outcome, is everybody feels safer. Everybody feels safer because there's not all this wild energy flying around. Even if it's suppressed, passive aggressive energy, it's still in the energy field is all this negative energy. So let's take it on, guys. Let's tame our triggers and use this formula and these steps to learn to intervene with yourself. And I promise you that you will have fabulous results. So I love you guys. And as always, I'd love to hear from you at helenhillix.com. And, check out all my other offerings. And I will talk to you next week.